Imagine walking through the dark streets of Boston on a cold November night in 1710. There are no streetlights, no patrol cars with flashing lights, no uniformed officers walking a beat. If you scream for help, no one is coming, at least not anyone whose job it is to protect you. There are no police, no detectives, no 911 to call. You are quite literally on your own. This was the reality for every colonist in early America. For over a century, the colonies operated without anything resembling modern police forces. Yet somehow, society didn't collapse into complete anarchy. Communities found ways to maintain order, enforce laws, and punish criminals, methods that were sometimes ingenious, often brutal, and occasionally utterly chaotic. But something had to change. As colonial cities grew larger, more diverse, and more complex, the old systems began to crack under pressure. Crime increased, social tensions flared, economic interests demanded protection, and slowly, reluctantly, American communities began creating the first organized law enforcement institutions, the ancestors of today's police departments. This is the story of that transformation. It's a story of slave patrols and night watches, of amateur constables and private security forces, of communities struggling to balance liberty with order. It's the origin story of American policing, and understanding where it came from helps us understand the complicated relationship between police and communities that persists today. Let's dive into the chaotic, fascinating world of early American law enforcement and discover how the first police forces were truly born. To understand how American law enforcement evolved, we must first grasp what colonists inherited from England and how the American experience forced adaptation of those traditions. English common law, which formed the foundation of colonial legal systems, was built around community-based law enforcement. The principle was simple: maintaining order was everyone's responsibility. Medieval England had developed several mechanisms for this communal policing. The hue and cry required all citizens to pursue suspected criminals when an alarm was raised. If you heard someone shout, "Stop, thief!" you were legally obligated to join the chase. The franc pledge system organized men into groups of 10 who were collectively responsible for each other's behavior. Constables, unpaid citizens serving rotating terms, handled basic law enforcement duties. Night watchmen patrolled after dark, calling out the hours and watching for fires and disturbances. These medieval English practices were transported to America, but the colonial environment transformed them profoundly. The colonies weren't compact villages but sprawling settlements separated by wilderness. The population wasn't homogeneous but increasingly diverse: English, Scottish, Irish, German, Dutch, African, and indigenous peoples living in close proximity. And crucially, the economic and social structures of colonial society created unique law enforcement needs that English traditions couldn't adequately address. The three main colonial regions developed distinctly different approaches to law enforcement, shaped by their economic systems, geography, and demographics. With its compact towns, religious cohesion, and relatively small enslaved population, maintained the closest approximation to English communal policing. Town meetings governed local affairs. Constables and night watchmen, drawn from the community through mandatory rotation, handled routine law enforcement. These weren't professional law enforcers. They were farmers, merchants, and craftsmen serving temporary terms, often reluctantly. The position of constable was so unpopular that men frequently paid fines to avoid serving. Night watch duty was similarly burdensome, standing guard through cold New England nights while your business or farm suffered from your absence. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey faced unique challenges from their commercial economies and ethnic diversity. Port cities like New York and Philadelphia grew rapidly, attracting sailors, merchants, laborers, and criminals from across the Atlantic world. These urban environments strained traditional communal policing. How could unpaid, amateur constables control rowdy taverns, dockside brawls, and organized theft rings? The solution was gradual professionalization. cities began paying night watchmen modest wages. Constables received fees for specific services, serving warrants, transporting prisoners, executing court orders. It wasn't yet a salaried police force, but it was moving in that direction. Particularly those dependent on plantation slavery developed the most distinctive and most disturbing form of law enforcement: slave patrols. Beginning in the late 1600s and formalized throughout the 1700s, these armed groups of white men had one primary function: controlling the enslaved population through surveillance, intimidation, and violence. South Carolina established the first formal slave patrol in 1704, followed by Virginia in 1726, North Carolina in 1753, and Georgia in 1757. These weren't informal vigilante groups but officially sanctioned, legally empowered organizations with written codes, regular patrols, and government funding. Patrollers had legal authority to stop any black person, demand proof they had permission to be off their owner's property, search slave quarters without warrants, break up gatherings, and administer summary punishments, usually whipping, for infractions. They were empowered to use lethal force against enslaved people who resisted or fled. This is crucial to understanding American policing's origins. The South's first organized, legally sanctioned, paid law enforcement institutions were explicitly designed for racial control. They weren't created to solve crimes or protect property in general, but specifically to prevent slave rebellions, capture fugitives, and terrorize the enslaved population into submission. By the mid-1700s, colonial America thus had a patchwork of law enforcement approaches: New England's amateur communal policing, the Middle Colonies, semi-professional urban watch systems, and the South's slave patrols. None resembled modern police departments. There were no uniforms, no badges, no standardized training, no professional career paths. Law enforcement was part-time, localized, and often more concerned with maintaining social hierarchies than solving crimes. Several factors in the mid to late 1700s would push these systems toward greater organization and professionalization. Urban growth created anonymity. You could no longer rely on everyone knowing everyone else. Economic development increased both property worth protecting and opportunities for theft. Immigration brought cultural diversity that strained communal trust, and most significantly, social tensions between classes, between ethnic groups, between enslaved and enslaver, created fears that demanded more organized responses than amateur constables could provide. The transformation from these colonial systems to recognizable police forces would take another century, but the foundations were being laid in the 1700s. And those foundations, built partly on English communal traditions, partly on urban commercial needs, and significantly on racial control, would shape American policing's character for centuries to come. Boston established America's first night watch in 1631, just 1 year after the city's founding. The system would operate for over 200 years, providing a window into how early American communities approached law enforcement and how those approaches evolved over time. Initially, the Boston Night Watch was a mandatory civic duty. All adult male citizens were required to take turns standing watch through the night, patrolling streets, watching for fires, and reporting disturbances. This was unpaid labor, a tax on time rather than money. The watch walked designated routes, carrying lanterns and staffs, calling out the hours and whether 10 o'clock and all's well, and ideally deterring crime through their presence. The reality was far less impressive than the theory. Men resented night watch duty intensely. It was cold, boring, and dangerous work that took them away from their livelihoods. Those who could afford it paid fines to avoid serving. By 1636, Boston allowed men to pay substitutes to take their place. This created a system where the poor and disreputable often served as watchmen, hardly the capable guardians the community needed. The night watch's effectiveness varied wildly. On quiet nights, watchmen might sleep in their watch boxes, small shelters stationed at street corners. On rowdy nights, particularly when sailors were in town or after public executions generated drunken crowds, watchmen were overwhelmed and sometimes assaulted. They had limited authority. They could stop suspicious persons and bring drunkards to the constable, but they couldn't arrest criminals or enter private property without warrants. A particularly revealing incident occurred in 1737. John Ballantyne, a watchman patrolling near the docks, encountered 3 sailors robbing a warehouse. Ballantyne called out the alarm, but the thieves attacked him, beating him severely and leaving him unconscious. No other watchmen came to his aid. They were either too far away to hear or unwilling to confront armed criminals. The thieves escaped with goods worth £50, roughly $10,000 today. Ballantyne recovered but quit the watch, and the warehouse owner offered a private reward for the thieves' capture since the city provided no mechanism for investigation. The case illustrated the night watch's fundamental limitations. Watchmen were passive observers, not active law enforcers. They could sound alarms but couldn't pursue criminals effectively. They had no training in investigation and no resources for tracking down offenders. And because they were temporary, reluctant, and poorly compensated, they lacked motivation to risk themselves confronting criminals. As Boston grew throughout the 1700s, reaching 16,000 people by 1750, the inadequacy of the night watch became increasingly apparent. The city responded with incremental reforms. In 1735, Boston began supplementing mandatory watch duty with paid watchmen, though still only part-time. By 1801, the city established its first permanent, fully paid night watch of 12 men. These weren't yet police officers. They still had limited powers and no daylight counterparts, but they represented a step toward professional law enforcement. The Boston Night Watch's evolution demonstrates how American communities slowly, reluctantly moved from unpaid civic duty toward paid, professional law enforcement. The transition wasn't driven by philosophical conviction, but by practical necessity. Cities grew too large and complex for amateur volunteers to maintain order. While Boston struggled with drunken sailors and warehouse thieves, Charleston, South Carolina faced what its white elite considered a far more existential threat: the possibility of slave rebellion. The colony's response, the slave patrol, represents the darkest chapter in American law enforcement's origin story. South Carolina's demographics created unique anxieties for white colonists. By 1708, enslaved Africans outnumbered whites in the colony, a ratio that would increase throughout the 1700s. In some low country districts, enslaved people outnumbered whites 10 to 1. White colonists lived in constant fear of rebellion, fear that seemed vindicated by several uprisings and conspiracies, including the Stono Rebellion of 1739, when approximately 100 enslaved people killed over 20 whites in an attempt to reach Spanish Florida. The 1704 Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and Slaves created South Carolina's formal slave patrol system. The law required all white men between ages 16 and 60 to serve on slave patrols, though wealthy planters could hire substitutes. Patrols were organized by militia districts, with captains appointed by the colonial government. They received modest compensation. Patrollers earned 20 shillings per night, plus rewards for capturing fugitives. The patrol's duties were explicitly written into law. They were required to conduct regular sweeps of plantations, searching slave quarters for weapons, stolen goods, or forbidden items like drums or horns that might be used to coordinate rebellions. They monitored roads, particularly at night, stopping any black person and demanding to see passes from their owners authorizing travel. Those without passes were presumed to be fugitives and could be whipped on the spot, typically 20 lashes, or taken to jail. Patrols broke up any unauthorized gatherings of black people, even religious services not supervised by whites. They were empowered to enter any property suspected of harboring fugitives and could use lethal force against enslaved people who resisted. A surviving patrol log from 1822 Charleston provides chilling details of the system in operation. Over a 2-week period, the patrol stopped 118 black people on the streets, whipped 23 for lacking proper passes, jailed 8 suspected runaways, and broke up 4 unauthorized gatherings. The log notes these activities in the same mundane tone you might record any routine work, evidence of how normalized racial violence had become. The patrols also engaged in psychological terror designed to maintain black subordination. They conducted surprise night raids on slave quarters, smashing into cabins, overturning belongings, and intimidating occupants. These raids had no specific law enforcement purpose. They were designed to ensure enslaved people never felt safe, even in their own quarters. The message was clear. White authority was absolute, omnipresent, and backed by violence. Historians argue that slave patrols represent the most organized, legally sanctioned law enforcement system in the colonial South. They had regular schedules, written regulations, government funding, and clear chains of command, all the hallmarks of professional policing. Municipalities like Charleston had larger and more sophisticated patrol systems than they had for protecting white citizens from ordinary crime. A warehouse theft might or might not be investigated, but the slave patrol rode every night without fail. After the American Revolution, slave patrols continued and expanded. States formalized their legal authority, increased funding, and in some cases created permanent, full-time patrol positions. Following Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, Southern states dramatically expanded their patrols, creating systems that closely resembled modern police forces, except their sole purpose was racial control through surveillance, intimidation, and violence. The legacy of slave patrols is uncomfortable but essential to understanding American policing. When Southern cities created their first formal police departments in the mid-1800s, New Orleans in 1852, Charleston in 1856, they built directly on the organizational structure and practices of slave patrols. Many early police officers had served on patrols. The tactics of stop and frisk, aggressive interrogation, and presumption of criminality toward black people all descended from patrol practices. This isn't ancient history without modern relevance. It's the foundation on which much of American policing was built. Philadelphia's experience illustrates how commercial urban environments created different law enforcement needs that pushed toward professionalization in different ways than either New England towns or Southern slave societies. Founded by Quakers committed to peace and equality before law, Philadelphia initially relied on constables chosen by lot from male citizens. As in other colonies, this was unpaid labor, a civic obligation men fulfilled reluctantly. By the early 1700s, Philadelphia allowed men to refuse service by paying fines, and eventually allowed them to hire substitutes. This created a peculiar profession, the professional substitute constable. These men made their living serving as constables for multiple citizens who paid them to fulfill civic obligations. It was quasi-privatized law enforcement. The constable was technically a public official, but actually worked for private citizens who paid his salary. Samuel Wellen, a Philadelphia constable in the 1770s, left detailed records of his work that reveal how this system functioned. Wellen served as substitute constable for 12 different men, collecting fees from each. His duties included serving court warrants, transporting prisoners, supervising public punishments, and responding to complaints from citizens, but only those who paid him. Wellen maintained a careful account book, noting every service and associated fee. Serving a warrant earned him 2 shillings. Transporting a prisoner to jail, 3 shillings. Supervising a public whipping, 5 shillings. Investigating a theft, but only if the victim paid him to do so. This fee-for-service model created perverse incentives. Constables had financial interest in arresting people. More arrests meant more fees for transporting prisoners and testifying in court. They had no incentive to prevent crime or help citizens who couldn't pay. The system literally made justice available only to those who could afford to hire a constable's services. Philadelphia's commercial economy created additional law enforcement needs that constables couldn't meet. Merchants wanted protection for warehouses, docks, and shipments. Insurance companies wanted investigation of suspicious fires and cargo losses. Wealthy neighborhoods wanted patrol services beyond what the night watch provided. The solution was private security forces. By 1750, Philadelphia had numerous private watch companies, groups of men hired by merchants, associations, insurance companies, or neighborhood coalitions to provide security. These weren't public servants but private employees protecting private interests. The Dock Ward Watch, funded by dockside merchants, patrolled the waterfront protecting warehouses and cargo. The Insurance Patrol, funded by marine insurance underwriters, investigated suspicious fires and cargo losses. Wealthy residential areas like Society Hill hired their own neighborhood patrols. This created a two-tier system. Areas with money got protection, while poor neighborhoods relied on ineffective night watches and fee-charging constables. The wealthy received proactive patrol and investigation services, while the poor received only reactive responses, and only if they could pay. The limitations of this fragmented system became apparent during crises. During the 1780 Fort Wilson riot, when a mob of Philadelphia militia attacked Federalist leaders holed up in James Wilson's mansion, neither constables nor private watch companies could effectively respond. The Pennsylvania militia had to be called out to restore order. The incident revealed that Philadelphia had no unified authority capable of handling large-scale public disorder. Just a patchwork of constables working for fees and private security forces, protecting their clients' interests. Philadelphia wouldn't create a unified, professional police department until 1854, but the groundwork was being laid throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s. The city gradually expanded paid watch forces, increased constable salaries, and created specialized positions like market inspectors and harbor masters with law enforcement duties. These incremental changes represented movement, slow, reluctant, fragmented, toward professional public policing. New York City in 1741 offers a case study in how law enforcement failures during crises could drive demands for more organized policing systems. In the spring of 1741, a series of fires broke out in Manhattan, destroying multiple buildings including the governor's mansion. In a city where roughly 20% of the population was enslaved, and where memories of a 1712 slave uprising lingered, authorities immediately suspected a slave conspiracy. What followed was a legal nightmare involving torture, coerced testimony, and mass executions, but also revealing the complete inadequacy of New York's law enforcement to either prevent the alleged conspiracy or investigate it properly. New York's law enforcement in 1741 consisted of a few constables, a small night watch, and informal militia musters. There was no detective capability, no investigative apparatus, no coordination between different authorities. When the fires broke out, officials had no systematic way to gather evidence, interview witnesses, or track suspects. Instead, they relied on torture and offers of clemency to extract confessions. The investigation, such as it was conducted by judges and magistrates, not specialized law enforcement. They interrogated suspects, mainly enslaved people and poor whites, using methods including waterboarding, prolonged isolation, and threats of burning alive. Witnesses gave contradictory testimony that shifted with each interrogation. The evidence was a mess of coerced confessions, hearsay, and accusations made to avoid torture. The legal proceedings resulted in 17 black men hanged, 13 burned alive, and 70 transported to brutal Caribbean slavery, essentially death sentences. 4 whites were also hanged. Modern historians largely agree no actual widespread conspiracy existed. The fires were likely accidental or the work of isolated individuals, magnified by paranoia into an imagined mass conspiracy. But for our purposes, what's significant is how the crisis exposed law enforcement inadequacies. City authorities had no way to quickly investigate crimes, secure evidence, or distinguish genuine threats from paranoia. They had no professional investigators, no protocols for handling complex cases, and no coordination between different jurisdictions. The result was catastrophic injustice and a community traumatized by both the alleged conspiracy and the brutal response. In the aftermath, New York began slowly strengthening its law enforcement. The city increased the size and funding of the night watch. It hired more constables and gave them broader authority. It established fire marshals to investigate suspicious fires. These weren't dramatic reforms. New York wouldn't create a unified police department until 1845, but they represented recognition that amateur, part-time law enforcement couldn't handle urban crises. The 1741 crisis, like similar events in other colonies, demonstrated that as American cities grew larger and more complex, the old English communal policing model couldn't cope with either ordinary crime or extraordinary emergencies. Something more organized, more professional, and more powerful was needed, though exactly what that should look like remained unclear for another century. The evolution of early American law enforcement systems from communal obligation to semi-professional institutions had profound consequences for how Americans understood authority, justice, and community responsibility. Perhaps the most significant impact was the creation of two-tiered justice systems based on ability to pay. When constables charged fees for services and wealthy neighborhoods hired private patrols, law enforcement became a commodity available to those who could afford it. This established a pattern that persists today. Wealthier communities receive better police protection, faster response times, and more thorough investigations than poorer areas. This economic stratification of security created class resentment. Working-class Philadelphians watching wealthy merchants, warehouses protected by private security, while their neighborhoods went unpatrolled understood that justice depended on wealth. This undermined the legitimacy of law enforcement institutions and created cynicism about whose interests the law actually served. The development of slave patrols, as the South's primary organized law enforcement, created a direct connection between policing and racial control that would echo through American history. The patrol system taught generations of white Southerners that law enforcement's primary purpose was maintaining racial hierarchy through surveillance, intimidation, and violence against black people. This racialization had psychological consequences beyond just creating mechanisms of oppression. It normalized racial violence as legitimate law enforcement and created community-wide participation in that violence. When serving on slave patrols was a mandatory civic duty, entire communities became implicated in racial terrorism. White Southerners learned to see black people as inherently criminal, requiring constant monitoring and violent discipline. The shift from mandatory civic duty to paid professional law enforcement represented a fundamental change in how communities understood their obligations to each other. In the communal model, everyone was responsible for public safety. In the professional model, public safety became someone else's job, someone you paid to handle unpleasant tasks you no longer wanted to perform yourself. This had mixed consequences. Professionalization brought competence and accountability that amateur systems lacked, but it also created distance between communities and their law enforcement. When your neighbor served as constable, you couldn't easily dehumanize the role or ignore its difficulties. When law enforcement became a specialized profession, communities could make demands without grappling with complexities, a dynamic that persists in modern tensions between police and communities. Early American law enforcement institutions had considerable power but minimal accountability. Constables and watchmen could arrest, detain, and use force, but there were few mechanisms to check their authority. Slave patrollers had essentially unlimited power over enslaved people with no oversight whatsoever. This established a pattern of law enforcement authority that outstripped accountability, a pattern that would require reform movements over the next 2 centuries to partially correct. The differential development of law enforcement in cities versus rural areas created lasting divides in how Americans thought about policing. Urban residents experienced increasing surveillance and regulation as watch systems expanded. Rural residents maintained more independence, but also more vulnerability to crime and violence. These different experiences shaped political attitudes about law enforcement. Urban populations more accepting of police authority, rural populations more suspicious of government power. The origins of American law enforcement in the 1700s and early 1800s cast long shadows over contemporary policing debates. Understanding these historical roots illuminates current tensions and challenges. Modern American policing faces a crisis of legitimacy, particularly in communities of color. This crisis has deep historical roots in law enforcement's origins. When policing in the South developed primarily as an instrument of racial control through slave patrols, it established patterns that persisted through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and into the present. The transition from slave patrols to police departments in southern cities involved continuity of personnel, tactics, and purpose. Racial control rebranded as crime control. Contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter explicitly connect modern police violence against Black Americans to this historical legacy. They argue that policing institutions built on racial oppression can't be reformed to serve racial justice. They must be fundamentally reimagined. Understanding the historical origins of Southern policing and slave patrols gives weight to these arguments in ways that focusing only on modern individual officers' behavior cannot. The early American pattern of privatized security, wealthy areas hiring protection while poor areas went unprotected, mirrors modern debates about private security forces, gated communities, and unequal police deployment. Today, wealthy neighborhoods receive frequent police patrols, rapid response times, and proactive community policing, while poor neighborhoods, particularly communities of color, experience either underpolicing, slow response to calls for help, or overpolicing, aggressive enforcement of minor offenses. This dual approach echoes the 1700s Philadelphia system, where merchants hired private patrols while the poor relied on fee-charging constables. The historical precedent suggests this isn't a bug but a feature. Law enforcement in America has always been partially privatized and class stratified. Addressing this requires grappling with our foundational assumptions about whether public safety is a universal right or a commodity distributed according to market principles. Modern community policing advocates often unknowingly echo colonial-era communal policing principles, the idea that law enforcement should emerge from and be accountable to communities rather than being imposed from outside. But the historical experience suggests this isn't a simple solution. Colonial communal policing was often ineffective, violent, and easily captured by local prejudices and power dynamics. The transition to professional policing occurred precisely because communal systems failed. Yet the failures of professional policing, distance from communities, lack of accountability, militarization, suggest that abandoning community connection entirely was also problematic. The challenge is synthesizing communal accountability with professional competence, neither fully returning to amateur community policing nor maintaining isolated professional forces. History suggests this balance is difficult to achieve and easy to lose. The slow, reluctant professionalization of American law enforcement in the 1700s and 1800s was driven by practical necessity. Growing cities and complex crimes required specialized skills and full-time attention that amateurs couldn't provide. Yet professionalization also created problematic distance between police and communities, and concentrated power in ways that enabled abuse. Modern calls for police reform wrestle with this same tension. Should we further professionalize policing through more training, higher education requirements, and specialized expertise? Or should we deprofessionalize by creating stronger community oversight, limiting police authority, and returning some functions to community-based solutions? The historical experience suggests there's no simple answer. Both amateur systems and professional systems have distinctive strengths and weaknesses. Early American law enforcement operated with minimal accountability. Constables answered loosely to magistrates, watchmen to nobody, and slave patrols to slaveholding interests. The absence of accountability enabled both corruption and abuse. Modern policing still struggles with accountability, qualified immunity, police unions that shield officers from consequences, internal investigations that rarely result in discipline, and blue walls of silence. The historical lesson is that law enforcement institutions don't naturally develop accountability. It must be imposed from outside through legal frameworks, community oversight, and political will. The colonial and early American periods show what happens without accountability. Privatized justice favoring the wealthy, racialized violence and corruption. Creating accountability requires deliberate institutional design, not just hoping law enforcement will police itself. Colonial and early American law enforcement was radically decentralized. Each community created its own systems with little standardization or coordination. This created vast variation in law enforcement quality and priorities, with some communities developing relatively effective systems while others descended into corruption or vigilantism. Modern American policing remains highly decentralized. Over 18,000 separate law enforcement agencies with minimal federal oversight or standardization. This decentralization has historical roots in colonial-era localism and suspicion of centralized authority. But it also creates problems. Inability to address crimes crossing jurisdictions, vast variation in training and standards, and difficulty implementing national reform agendas. The historical precedent suggests Americans have always been ambivalent about centralized law enforcement authority, valuing local control even when it produces problematic outcomes. As we've traced the origins of American law enforcement from the 1700s through the early 1800s, we've witnessed a transformation driven by necessity, shaped by economics, and scarred by racial oppression. We began in communities without professional law enforcement, where citizens reluctantly served as part-time constables and night watchmen, where wealthy merchants hired private security, and where Southern slave patrols created America's most organized early policing institutions, explicitly designed for racial control through violence and intimidation. We've seen how urban growth, commercial expansion, and social tensions slowly pushed communities toward more organized, professional law enforcement, though the transformation was gradual, uneven, and incomplete. The systems created during this period weren't neutral or benevolent. They were instruments of class and racial power, protecting property more than people, serving the wealthy more than the poor, and in the South, explicitly functioning to maintain white supremacy through terrorism against black people. These weren't unfortunate aberrations or the actions of a few bad individuals. They were the foundational design of American law enforcement institutions. Understanding this history doesn't provide easy answers to contemporary policing challenges, but it does provide essential context. It explains why communities of color view police with suspicion, because policing institutions in America were often created to control them, not protect them. It explains why law enforcement tends to protect wealth and property more aggressively than people, because that was often its primary original purpose. It explains why accountability is so difficult to achieve, because early law enforcement institutions operated with minimal oversight and developed cultures resistant to external constraint. This history also reveals that American law enforcement is not inevitable or natural. It was created by human choices to serve specific purposes. The slave patrols weren't mandated by universal human nature, but created by Southern legislatures to serve slaveholders' interests. The fee-for-service constable system wasn't eternal, but a choice that made justice dependent on wealth. The slow movement toward professional policing wasn't predetermined, but driven by specific social and economic pressures that could have been addressed differently. If law enforcement institutions were created by human choices, they can be changed by human choices. But change requires understanding what we're changing. Not just isolated modern problems, but institutional patterns and cultural assumptions rooted in centuries of history. So we ask you, knowing that American law enforcement emerged partly from communal protection, partly from commercial interests demanding security for property, and significantly from racial control systems designed to terrorize enslaved people, how does that historical foundation shape contemporary policing? Can institutions built on these foundations be reformed to serve justice and equality? Or do we need to fundamentally reimagine what public safety looks like, building new institutions without these corrupt foundations? And perhaps most importantly, what responsibilities do we as community members bear for our law enforcement institutions? The colonial model made law enforcement everyone's obligation. The professional model made it someone else's job. Where's the right balance between community participation and professional expertise, between local control and standardized accountability? These aren't comfortable questions. The history we've explored today reveals that the relationship between law enforcement and justice in America has always been complicated, often broken, and deeply entangled with class power and racial oppression. Confronting that history is difficult, but it's necessary if we want to create something better. We'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you see these historical patterns reflected in modern policing? What lessons from this history should inform contemporary reform efforts? What would truly just, effective, and accountable law enforcement look like? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If this historical exploration has challenged your thinking or taught you something new about the origins of American law enforcement, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the historical roots of contemporary issues. Next time, we'll be examining another crucial aspect of early American justice, how courts and punishment systems evolved alongside law enforcement, and what that tells us about how Americans have always understood crime, punishment, and justice. Until then, remember, those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it, but those who study history critically are empowered to change it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.